Quilting feather designs in thinner borders and sashings is not only fun, it's the perfect way to add a curvy, feathery look to your quilting. Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters from quiltingismytherapy.com, and welcome to the second video in the Machine Quilting Feathers Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along video series. To learn more about the video series or to check out the custom products I designed just for the videos, all you have to do is click the link in the description box below or visit quiltingismytherapy.com. Now in the first video in this series, we learned the basics of machine quilting feathers, kind of broke them down to their basic components. And if you haven't already watched the first video in the series, be sure to check it out. Because in this video, we're gonna learn 5 different feather designs that are perfect for those thinner borders and sashings. I'm gonna demonstrate how to quilt them on a sewing machine and a long arm, and I'll give you tips on how to change them up to create some pretty neat variations. Plus, be sure to hang out to the end of the video because I'm going to tell you how you can get some free quilting diagrams and tips for the designs that we're going to be learning in this series. Well, now that we have that out of the way, let's kick it off with our first design, the half feather. Now, while I love the look of those thinner borders and sashings, the one thing I don't love is I can't fit a full feather in those areas. But that's not going to stop me from quilting feathers on my quilts. Instead of using that whole feather, we can quilt part of it to create the designs that we need for our thinner borders and sashings. Instead of quilting a spine down the middle of that area, I'm going to use the border as the spine of my feather and quilt my petals so they extend from there. The great thing about this technique is you can do it with any kind of feather. For this one, I'm going to use that feather where we build off from the bottom. Starting at the bottom of my area, quilting that line that curves out to the other side, traveling along the edge of that petal, and then swinging out and quilting my next one. And I'm trying to quilt that line so that it looks like it's merging into the side of that border. From there, I'm going to travel up the edge just a bit and quilt my next group of petals. I'm basically going to repeat that, continuing to quilt those feathers, working my way along that border. Not only does this let me use that feather design in those thinner areas, since all the lines come to this side, that's going to help draw attention to the center of that block. So I'm going to make sure to quilt this around blocks or areas that I want to show off. And if you have a block that has a border or sashing all the way around it, quilting that feather so that it wraps around that block is just another great way to highlight it. Again, I had that beautiful, curvy, feathery look that looks just gorgeous on the quilt. Another great thing about this design is it's a perfect way to transition into doing those bigger feathers, especially if you're only comfortable quilting them in one direction. This is going to allow you to get that shape down before you try to switch back and forth. Now in this example, I use a type of feather where we quilt those petals in groups of 2, working their way from the bottom up. But we learned in an earlier video that there's another feather that's quilted from the top down. Let me show you what that looks like. The lines are still going to come back to one side of my border. I'm simply going to quilt a half heart shape that swings out and comes back, merging into that side. And as you're quilting your feathers, don't be afraid to really extend it out towards that opposite edge. I want these feathers to really fill in that area. I know that can be kind of scary at first, but remember, once you're done quilting, the part that's going to stand out is that unquilted area in the petal, not necessarily the lines of quilting. Now so far I've been quilting these sashing strips that have cornerstones in them. That means I don't have to try to quilt that feather around the corner, but sometimes that's not going to be the case. We're going to want to quilt that feather so that it wraps all the way around that border corner. Let me show you how easy it is to do that on the long arm. When I quilt that first petal, I'm just going to quilt it so that it comes out and then just stops in the middle of nowhere, because eventually I'm going to quilt all the way around the square and connect it at the end. And just like we saw earlier, I'm quilting those petals in groups of 2 by quilting that line that curves out, touching the petal below, traveling back, and returning back to the side. Once I start to approach the corner of that border, I'm going to quilt the petals so that they return to that inner corner, which is going to allow me to pivot around. Once I filled in that corner, I can start quilting the petals in the next direction. I definitely think the trickiest part about quilting this design on a long arm is that you have to learn how to do it in all different directions, from left to right to left, up and down, and vice versa. So as you're quilting, just take your time and think through the next couple steps. It may feel frustrating at first, but I promise eventually it's going to click. And for the last corner, we're going to do the same thing, quilting those petals until I reach that inner border corner. And then quilt them so that they extend out and pivot back to that point. Now I'm beginning to approach my starting point, and this is where it can get just a little tricky. I'm going to try to quilt my petals so that I end connected to the starting point. Usually when I get a few inches away, I'll pause and kind of think through how many petals can I fit in here. Then if I need to adjust them by making them smaller or bigger, I can do that. And even if it doesn't turn out quite perfect, once you step back and see the whole feather, it's going to be fine. For this design, we're going to be using a half heart shape to create a feather-like design. It's not a true feather, but it's the perfect way to tiptoe into quilting those more complex feathers or as a way for filling in those thinner borders. So starting from the top of my sashing strip, I'm going to quilt a line that kind of curves down towards the center. This is just going to get me in position to start quilting those hearts. It doesn't have to be anything too long, again, just to kind of get from that edge down a little bit. Now that I'm in place, I'm going to start by quilting my first half heart shape by quilting that line that curves out and scoops back towards the center. Now from here, normally when we're drawing a heart, we would draw or quilt the other side of it, but we're not going to do that. Starting from the bottom of that heart, I'm going to quilt another one that goes the opposite direction. So again, that half heart shape, they're just going to be staggered a little bit. These hearts aren't going to quite connect with each other. They're going to line up instead, alternating directions. What I love about it is it still gives me that feathery kind of look. It's a great transition to learning how to quilt those petals, and most of us have doodled or drawn hearts before, so we all kind of know how the shape goes. And as I reach the bottom of my area, I'm going to quilt that last heart so that it runs into that seam. But to fill in this last little bit of unquilted area, I'm going to quilt one last little curve. Now, depending on how big your border is or how dense you want your quilting, you can quilt those hearts so they're closer together. To do this, as I'm quilting those hearts, I'm not going to quilt that bottom point very long. I'm going to keep them a little bit shorter so they stack in closer to each other. And as we can see, there's not as much gap in between those hearts, so it's going to make it a little bit more dense and a little bit more complex looking. I prefer to quilt this design so that I'm working from the top down. I kind of like to start with the curvier part of my heart and then end at that point. But you might find it easier going the opposite direction, starting from the bottom and quilting up. Either one is totally fine. Just try both of them and see which one feels a little bit more natural to you. I can tell I really have to think when I'm doing it this way because it's not quite as natural to me. But however you go about quilting those heart shapes, the most important thing here is that I want to fill in that border or sashing as much as possible. I'm trying to quilt those hearts so they get close to the edge of that area without going over. Now, let's check out the next design that's perfect for those thinner borders or sashings. The flipped feather design adds a beautiful look to those thinner borders by switching directions of our petals. That's going to give the quilting a beautiful, curvy, feathery look without drawing attention to one side of the border or the other. So I'm looking at my border, and I'm going to start in one of the corners, and I'm going to quilt the petals that go out and back. So starting from here, I'm going to quilt a line that curves out towards the other side, stopping when it touches the bottom of my border. From here, I'm going to backtrack a little bit and then swing out and quilt another petal that comes back to the first side. So I'm essentially quilting these petals in groups of two. One of them goes out, travels, and then comes back. So I have my first two petals right here, and I'm going to quilt a third one that goes out, touching those previously quilted ones, until I have a beautiful group of 3 petals. Now, after I've quilted my group of 3, I'm going to quilt another one going in the opposite direction. So up to this point, I've been starting from this side of the border, quilting my line out here. But now I'm going to change direction by going around that feather, out and past it, and quilting a petal that faces that opposite direction. So I was right here, swung around, quilted that petal facing the opposite direction, stopping when it touched that previously quilted one. And now that I'm heading in that direction, I'm going to quilt a couple more petals by traveling back along the one I've quilted, quilting that next petal that swings out and comes back into the side of the border. And then I'm going to go right into quilting a third one. The reason I'm quilting them in groups of 3 is that it allows me to end at the higher side of my design. So looking at my quilting, this side of my feather is higher than over here. And that's when I know it's time to change direction by quilting around there, coming out and quilting another petal that touches the previously quilted ones. Now, if you're just trying to get the hang of quilting feathers, this might be a little tricky at first since we're alternating directions. At any point, you can stop and kind of think through the next couple steps. Sometimes just tracing that out with your fingertips kind of gives you an idea of where you're going to go next. When I'm ready to change direction, I always want to end up touching the curvy side of that feather because that means that I'm on the opposite side from where I started. I like to give myself a routine where I quilt 3 of those petals and then I switch, but you can totally change that up to make it work for you. And once I have that routine down, I can keep quilting the design until I run into the edge of my area. Like I said, this design has that nice kind of curvy, feathery look, and the fact that those petals change direction as I'm quilting means it's not going to draw attention to one side of the border or the other. Not only is this design fast and fun to quilt, but it's really easy to change it up to create some variations. Let me show you what one of those looks like by quilting it on the long arm. For this variation, we're going to start off with a swirl that starts from one corner, swirls out to the other side, and then echoes back to the starting point. From here, I can quilt my next petal by quilting a line that swings out and ends touching that swirl. If I wanted to, I could add some more swirls, or I could go ahead and flip it around the other direction, which is what I'm going to do here. I'm going to travel along the edge of this feather, swing out, and then quilt a swirl that goes the opposite direction. Then I'm going to continue doing that, alternating directions, quilting my swirl, echoing back, and then adding those feather petals. If you want to change it up a little bit, you can add extra petals before you switch directions. So there's my swirl, my petals. I'm on my higher end right here, so it's a perfect opportunity to change directions by quilting that line that comes out to that swirl and echoes back. And then if I have any little unquilted gaps at the top of my border, I can add just another little petal to fill it in. Now for this next design, we're still going to stick with that same idea of switching directions of our petals, except we're going to quilt them a different way. So starting from the edge of my area, I'm going to quilt a line that curves out towards the other side and ends in a teardrop. And when I quilt that teardrop, I really want it to look as though it's merging into that curve. Basically, this is acting as the spine of my feather, and this is the area that I'm going to fill in with my petals. Now we're going to use that type of feather where we work from the top down, quilting that half heart shape, filling in that area until I get to my starting point. So there's my first section of my design. That curve that goes out, ends in that teardrop, and then becomes the spine of my feather. Now, as I'm filling in that unquilted area, my petals might be a little bit smaller or bigger. That's totally fine. The most important thing here is that I want to fill in this area as much as possible. Now, once I get back to that starting point, I'm going to echo around that curve and go right into another curve that faces the opposite direction, again, ending in that teardrop. And like we saw with the previous one, that's going to leave me an unquilted area right here that's perfect for filling in with those petals. Then once I get to the bottom where I don't have any more room, I'm going to do the same thing, echoing around that previously quilted one and quilting a curve that goes that opposite direction. Now in the beginning, this might be a little bit trickier, again, because we're changing the direction of our petals. But like I said with the previous design, just take your time as you're working through it. Sometimes marking out the design beforehand might make it just a little bit easier. Now once I fill in that whole area, I have that beautiful kind of scooped feather look that changes direction. And you don't have to worry that all those arcs are the same exact size. The most important thing is that I'm filling in that unquilted area. So as I'm quilting, sometimes my arcs might be a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. It's totally fine. I'm not trying to keep them perfect. I'm just trying to fill in that area. And what I like about this is we're just using a little portion of that feather and repeating it over and over again to create our design. Not only does it look great, it's super easy to create some variations with this design. Let me show you what that looks like on the long arm. For a slightly different look to your design, you can add a little embellishment by throwing in some swirls. So just like we did the first design, I'm quilting that curve and ending in that first petal. However, this time, instead of quilting more petals in this area, I'm going to quilt a line that curls out into a swirl and echo my way back. Then from here, I'm going to echo around that petal, curving out and ending in another petal that faces the opposite direction. I'm basically just replacing some of the petals on my feather with swirls. And you can play with this design and come up with as many variations as you'd like, whether you add a couple petals and then a swirl, or keep it nice and simple with one petal. Either way, it's going to look amazing on your quilts. Not only does it give the quilting a slightly different look, but you might find it a little bit easier since there's less petals to quilt. Next up, let's go small. For borders or sashings that are 3 to 4 inches wide, the mini feather is shrunken down to fit in that space. Scaling it down lets us keep that beautiful, curvy, feathery look even in those smaller areas. Not only is it great practice for quilting big feathers, you can change out the petals and create some really neat variations with this design. The mini feather is quilted the same as a regular feather. The only difference is how I'm going to go about quilting it. Instead of quilting one side and then the other, I'm going to alternate between the two. Now we're going to quilt this one with the custom feather, where we're quilting those petals that stack up from the bottom. I'm going to quilt my spine so that it's a gently curvy line towards the center of that area. Now that I have that spine, I'm going to start quilting my petals, quilting them in groups of 2 where one comes out, travels, and comes back in. Then once I have 2 petals on one side, I'm going to do the same on the other. And I'm going to keep doing that, quilting those petals in groups of 2, alternating directions. Quilting these petals in smaller spaces means I need to begin my turn before I get to the edge of my area. This is where looking ahead of the needle and the direction you're heading will be really helpful. So if you're constantly getting petals that are kind of chopped off on the end because you run out of room, it might help to begin that curve a little bit sooner. Now what I love about these feathers is, to me, they're a little bit more whimsical and fun, and I feel like I can change them up a little bit. So as I'm quilting my petals, I might throw some swirls in randomly or change the shape of my petals just to give it a slightly different look. We're not only learning how to quilt this feather, we're learning how to fill in a defined area. But you might find that having boundaries makes it a little bit easier to quilt because it gives your brain one less thing to think about. I love how this feather not only gives me that beautiful feathery look, it lets me practice with quilting on a smaller scale while adding a beautiful whimsical look to my quilting. Now for this example, I quilted it with a custom feather where I'm quilting those petals in groups of 2 starting from the bottom. But this also works great with a classic feather that we learned in the first video. I'm going to quilt my spine just like I did earlier, a gently curvy line that's towards the center of my area, and I'm going to begin quilting my petals in those half-heart shapes, alternating directions and working my way down that spine. Same basic idea with a slightly different look. Now for an even more compact mini feather, you can leave that spine out altogether. I know, it sounds a little bit crazy, and I'm going to show you how to do that on the long arm quilting machine. Instead of quilting that spine down the center of the border, I'm going to skip it altogether, quilting a couple of petals and then switching sides just like we did before. As I'm quilting those petals, instead of running that line into the spine, I'm going to try to run it into the petal on the other side. When I'm done, it'll look like there's a spine to my feather, even though there isn't. This design is perfect for long, skinny borders. Since I'm leaving out the spine, I don't have to quilt my way all the way down the area and then add my petals coming back up. I can just start from the top and work my way down. And if you want to get silly with this design, you can throw in some swirls and other shapes. So whether you change up the design using different petals, add the spine or not, this design is going to be perfect for those thinner borders of your quilt when you want to add that beautiful feathery touch. There are so many different ways that you can quilt feathers in those thinner borders and sashings on your quilts. Whether you embrace the heart design, or switch up the directions of your petals, or even shrink them down to fill in those thinner areas, I just know they're going to look great on your quilts. Now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel I designed for the video series, go ahead and quilt in the areas highlighted in red. You can try the designs I've showed you in the video, or you can come up with your own design ideas. It really is kind of like a choose your own quilting adventure. And as always, I have free downloadable quilting diagrams that will help you be successful with the designs that we're learning in the series. Or if you need a little bit more in-depth instruction, you can check out the expanded resource PDF. It's going to have everything that you need to be successful with the designs that we're learning throughout the video series. To learn more about either one of those, all you have to do is click the link in the description box below, or visit quiltingismytherapy.com. Well, I'll be back soon with the next video in the series where I'm going to show you some of my favorite feather designs for quilt blocks. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.